How did a 31-year-old horse trainer scam over $2.4 million with a shovel, a trapdoor, and a 16-year-old boy? Welcome to Sports Scams. I'm Tommy Burns, and this is the story of James the Grafter Kingsley. The year is 1903, and horse racing is part of everyday life in Australia. There are racetracks in every state, city and town, including Newcastle, which is about 170 kilometres north of Sydney in New South Wales. Here we meet James the Grafter Kingsley, a well-rounded horse trainer, owner and punter. He's well known for scams, rorts and cons all around town. You don't get the name the Grafter due to your honesty. He's the type of bloke who would dress his friends up as wealthy businessmen and then introduce them to bookmakers at racetracks as a sucker, just so he could get bets on credit. When they won, they would quickly collect for Kingsley, but when they lost, they and Kingsley would do a runner without paying their debts. He was an absolute delinquent, but he did have a few creative ways on making a quick buck. On April 20 that year, Kingsley brought one of his horses, ironically named Gentleman Jim, to the Newcastle racetrack to run in race 2 over 1,200 metres. Gentleman Jim was an okay horse. He'd won a few races, and on that day, he was first up after a spell and had been given a weight of 67 kilos. Due to these two factors, being a lack of fitness and a big weight, Gentleman Jim wasn't expected to be in the finish by most bookies, and thus a price of 20-1 was offered to the punters. That means for every $1 you bet on him to win, you would get back 20 if he did so. To give you an idea of how weights work in horse racing, most races are handicap races. This is where horses carry different weights allocated by a handicapper to help make it a fairer contest. This weight is a combination of the jockey's own weight and their kit, which is their saddle, and sometimes additional lead plates to help make up any difference. A faster horse will often carry a bigger weight compared to slower horses to give it a disadvantage. But how much of a disadvantage? The general rule is that for every 1 kilogram a horse carries, it can slow it down by as much as 6 lengths, or up to 14 metres. Just keep that in mind for later. Leading up to race 2 that day, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a regular day at the track. That was about 10 minutes before the race jump time when Kingsley and his mates swooped on the bookmakers, placing huge sums of money on Gentleman Jim to win at the big odds. You may have heard the expression, they were jumping out of trees to back this thing. So, imagine a flock of eagle-eyed punters all strategically placed around the racetrack waiting for feeding time. And the meal of that day were the local bookies. And they were not happy. And it was for good reason. Gentleman Jim came in an almost too easy winner, to the delight of Kingsley and the ire of local bookies and rival trainers. However, it was at this point where his scam began to unravel. Now, for any race result to be declared official, meaning that all bets can be paid, the winning jockey must weigh in front of race club officials to ensure that they did in fact carry their correct weight. As Kingsley was making his way past angry locals who could smell a rat, word had got out that the jockey of Gentleman Jim had weighed in light on the jockey scales. How light? Well, 11 kilos, or 24 pounds lighter than he should have been. No wonder Gentleman Jim had won so easily. He had about 100 metres advantage against his rivals. Under the rules of racing, the officials were about to disqualify Gentleman Jim, meaning Kingsley would have lost the lot, and the race would be awarded to the runner-up, Silk, whose trainer had been the first person to heckle Kingsley after the race. But Kingsley would have none of it. He began to visually show his frustration by yelling and shouting and stomping his feet on the floorboards like a giant toddler throwing a tantrum. He demanded the jockey be weighed again, and the officials quickly agreed. But to their shock and Kingsley's relief, the jockey weighed the correct weight of 67 kilos. The officials had no other choice. They had to declare the race result final and have all bets paid. Kingsley and his mates that day walked out of the Newcastle racetrack with over £15,000, which is the equivalent today of over 2.4 million Australian dollars. Not a bad earn if you can get it. But not everyone was convinced, and it was at that time that the entire scam was exposed. The racecourse officials held a meeting later that day to discuss why the jockey scales had malfunctioned for such a short period of time. And it was at this point that a discovery was made that would go down in racing infamy, something that wouldn't look out of place in a Hollywood movie. When inspecting the bottom of the jockey scales near the edge of the floorboards, one of the officials noticed a small wire. He then lifted the floorboards that Kingsley had been stopping only hours earlier, and underneath was the shocking discovery of a 16-year-old boy named George Lucas sitting in a hole underneath the scales, staring straight back at them. What the f***? Upon further inspection, officials saw that within the hole was a lantern, a trowel, a screwdriver, an uneaten meat pie, a bottle of ginger ale, and a small pulley system with a wire attached to an 11-kilo lead plate. As the young lad was excavated out of the hole, the Kingsley scam had finally been unveiled. Amazingly, the night before, Kingsley and his crew had dug a hole around the track with access via a trapdoor into the jockey scales room. Lucas then stayed overnight inside the hole, awaiting his big moment to perform the scam with the promise of being rescued after dark the following day. His job was to attach the 11-kilogram lead plate to the wire at the bottom of the scales. This would ensure that anyone standing on the scales at the right time would be shown to weigh substantially more than they actually were. And his cue to attach the lead weight to the scales? Yep, the sound of heavy stomping on the floorboards above. If only Kingsley had been a tad quicker in getting to the jockey room before the official weigh-in took place. Otherwise, we may not even be here telling this story. But the story doesn't end there. Upon further investigation into another betting plunge at a nearby racetrack, officials lifted up the jockey scales to again find another hole in the floor. Heavy weights and a string apparatus were found in the hole, and it was obvious that the grafter had done this before. But it wouldn't continue. Although substantially richer following the scam, the investigation resulted in Kingsley, Lucas, and the jockey Herbert Moran all charged with defrauding the Newcastle Jockey Club, and they were banned for life from all racetracks in Australia. But as you would expect, this did not stop Kingsley from continuing his career in scams and rorts in horse racing, but as an outsider. In fact, he actually purchased a double-decker bus so he could sit on top of it outside the fence and still watch the races. This was up until 1921, when his life ban was lifted following the peace celebrations at the end of World War I, and he could continue his scams and rorts from inside again. This has been Sports Scams. We'll see you next time.